Get someone else!
Richard Sterling had given that order to 3 nurses already. He'd survived Fallujah Sangin 2 Purple Hearts. He wasn't about to let some civilian touch him. Then Catherine Bennett walked in. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She pulled up her left sleeve. The tattoo stopped him cold. Fleet Marine Force. 3-5 Dark Horse. His unit. His war. The most decorated Marine in the room had just been outranked by the woman he'd dismissed, and he had no idea what she knew about the night his men died. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell on this channel. Hit subscribe and stay with us. It's worth it. The Carl Vinson Veterans Affairs Medical Center ran on controlled chaos. Understaffed, overbooked, and perpetually behind on paperwork, it was the kind of place that separated people who were good at their jobs from people who merely thought they were. Catherine Bennett had worked there for 6 years, and nobody who'd watched her work would put her in the second category. She wasn't the warmest nurse on the floor. She didn't bring homemade cookies to staff meetings or remember birthdays. What she did was move through a crisis like water finding its level fast, efficient, and completely without drama. Colleagues trusted her the way you trust a seatbelt, not because it's comfortable, but because you've seen what happens without one. One thing people noticed early and stopped asking about Kat wore long-sleeved scrubs every shift. The building ran warm. Nobody wore long sleeves. But after the first few weeks, it became part of the furniture. Just another thing that was true about her, like the fact that she took her coffee black or never raised her voice at a patient, not once. She was reviewing discharge paperwork at the nurses' station when she heard it a crash, sharp and deliberate, followed by voices bleeding through the walls from down the hall. She didn't look up immediately. Crashes happened. What made her lift her head was the silence that followed, the specific kind that meant someone had decided not to respond. Brenda Holt appeared at the end of the corridor 30 seconds later. Brenda had been a nurse for 11 years. She'd worked pediatric oncology before transferring to the VA, which meant she'd already done her time in the rooms where the hardest things happened. Kat had never seen her rattled. She was rattled now. Her hands weren't shaking. Brenda was too professional for that, but her jaw was set in the way that meant she was holding something down. She stopped at the station, placed the patient chart on the desk with slightly too much force, and said, without looking at Kat, "He threw the breakfast tray, told me I was useless, told me people like me couldn't understand what real suffering felt like." A beat. Then he said some other things I'm not going to repeat. Kat looked at the chart. Room 714. The name was Richard Sterling. 62 years old. Osteomyelitis, a bone infection that had been progressing for weeks before he finally came in the kind of delay that told its own story about a man's relationship with asking for help. Complicating factors included cardiac history and a fever that had been climbing since admission. The attending had flagged him as critical pending. If he missed another dose of vancomycin, the infection could cross into his bloodstream before morning. Kat read through the medical history first. Then she turned to the service record. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Sangin Province, Afghanistan, 2010. She read it twice. Then she set the chart down flat on the desk, the way you set something down when you want your hands free. Her jaw tightened just once, just briefly, and then her face went back to exactly what it always was. "I'll take him," she said. Brenda looked at her. "Kat, get the vancomycin prepped and have it ready at the station." She was already standing, already picking up her badge from the desk where she'd set it earlier. "I'll go in at 0900. She didn't go straight to room 714. She went to the small consultation room 2 doors down, sat with the chart for 8 minutes, and read the service record a 3rd time. Not because she'd missed anything, Because there are facts you need to sit with before you can carry them into a room without showing what they cost you. Dr. Marcus Webb found her there. He was the attending on the floor, 50s, tired eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been managing impossible situations long enough that he'd stopped pretending they were solvable. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said, "Brenda told me you volunteered." "Yes." "You know his history." "I read the file." Webb was quiet for a moment. "He's refused the central line twice. He pulled the peripheral IV out this morning. If he misses the next infusion window, we're looking at sepsis by tonight." He was choosing his words with the precision of someone who'd already had this conversation with himself. "If he won't consent to treatment, and I can't reach him, I'm going to have to bring in psych and security. I don't want to do that." "I know. I'm giving you until 1000 hours. If nothing's changed, I don't have a choice." Kat looked up from the chart. "I understand." Webb stood there a moment longer like he wanted to ask something else. He didn't. He left her with the file and the 8 minutes she still had before 9 o'clock. Brenda was waiting outside the consultation room when Kat came out. She didn't look like she was there by accident. "He's not just angry," Brenda said. It came out low, almost careful, like she was trying to hand something fragile across a distance. "I've had angry patients. I've had patients who threw things at me. This is different." She looked down the hall toward 714. "He's not fighting us. He's fighting something else, and we're just in the way." Kat listened to all of it. Then she picked up the prepared IV kit from the station and the worn canvas bag she kept under the desk, the one she brought every shift and rarely opened at work, and said, "I'll be out by 10. She pushed open the door to room 714. Richard Sterling looked like a man who had once been formidable and was furious that he still was. The illness had taken weight off him, and the fever had put a gray cast over his skin. He was sitting upright in the bed with the posture of someone who'd spent decades refusing to be anything else. The breakfast tray was on the floor where it had landed. He didn't look at it. He looked at Kat the moment she walked in with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who made decisions about people in the first 3 seconds. "If you're here about the medication," he said, "you can turn around." Kat set the IV kit on the table beside the bed and the canvas bag on the chair by the wall. She didn't rush. She checked the equipment the way she always checked equipment, methodically, without performance. "I want the attending physician," Richard said. His voice was the kind that had spent years carrying across noise. "Not a nurse, not support staff. I want the doctor. Dr. Webb is aware I'm here. Then he can come in himself." Kat looked at him directly. Not challenging, just clear. "He's not going to come in himself. I'm the one who's going to place the central line." Something shifted in Richard's expression, not softening, but a recalibration, like a man adjusting his aim. "You people don't understand what you're dealing with," he said. "You sit in this building in these rooms and you think that because you've seen suffering, you understand it. You don't. You understand paperwork. You understand protocols." His voice didn't rise. That was almost worse. "You have no idea what real loss looks like, what it costs a person. So do me the courtesy of not pretending otherwise and get out of my room." Kat stood at the bedside table for a moment, her hand resting on the IV kit. The monitors were recording everything. The room wasn't saying, his heart rate elevated, his temperature still climbing. His body fighting a battle his pride was trying to keep him from letting anyone help with. She picked up the kit, looked at him once more, not with pity, not with frustration, but with the particular attention of someone who was still deciding something. "I'll be back at 1000, she said. "The medication will go in before I leave this room." She walked out. Not retreating, there's a difference, though it can look the same from the outside. Retreating is when you leave because you've run out of will. What Kat did was leave because she needed 1 hour, and she'd just told him exactly that. Back at the nurse's station, she set the IV kit down and stood still for a moment, her back to the hallway. Brenda approached from the side, not directly. "How bad?" "He's in pain and he's running a fever, and he's been in command of other people for so long that he doesn't know how to be the one in the bed." Kat straightened the items on the counter that didn't need straightening. "He'll take the line." "What makes you sure?" Kat didn't answer that. She looked down the hall toward 714, where the door had swung most of the way shut, leaving just a gap of shadow. "Because I'm not going to give him a reason not to," she said. She sat back down at the station, with 17 minutes remaining before she had to go back in. She didn't look at the chart again. She already knew everything in it. What she was doing for those 17 minutes was something harder to name, the kind of stillness that isn't rest, but preparation. The hallway outside room 714 was quiet. Brenda went back to her other patients. Webb returned to his office. The floor moved around Kat the way it always did, full of its own emergencies, its own negotiations between what medicine could do and what people would allow. At exactly 1000 hours, Catherine Bennett picked up the IV kit, walked down the hall, and pushed open the door to room 714 for the second time. Richard was sitting in the same position he'd been in an hour earlier. Upright, spine straight, as though the bed were a chair he'd chosen, rather than a surface he'd been assigned. But the hour had not been kind to him. His color had worsened. The fever was doing what fevers do when they go unaddressed. It was winning ground. He looked at Kat when she came through the door, and something in his expression said he'd expected her back, and hadn't decided yet how he felt about that. Kat set the IV kit on the tray table and began checking the equipment without speaking. She'd learned early in her career that silence was a tool same as any other, that the space before words could either pressure a person or give them room depending on how you held it. Richard gave it about 45 seconds before he filled it. "I told you what I wanted," he said. "You did." Kat checked the line connections, methodical as always. "And I told you what was going to happen. You people think that persistence is a substitute for understanding." His voice had the rough edge of fever and sleeplessness, but the authority underneath it was still intact. "You think if you just keep showing up, eventually the patient breaks down and lets you do whatever you want. That's not care. That's attrition." "You're right," Kat said. "That's not care." She looked up from the kit. "This is different. You haven't told me one thing that makes you different from the last 3 people I sent out of this room." Kat didn't answer that yet. She moved the tray table closer, noted his vitals on the monitor, heart rate, elevated temperature at 103.1, and began preparing the site on his neck for the central line. He let her get close enough to confirm she knew what she was doing, then pulled back. "Don't." The word was flat and hard. Final the way orders are final. Kat straightened. She looked at him, not the chart, not the monitor, not the door. Him. He was staring at a fixed point on the wall across the room, the way people stare at things that aren't there. The fever was making the edges of things soft. She'd seen it before in critical patients, the way a high enough temperature starts to dissolve the membrane between now and then, until a person is half in the room with you and half somewhere else entirely. "They don't know what it costs," Richard said. His voice had shifted lower now, less directed at her and more at the room. "You train men. You put them in your care. You make decisions, and those decisions have consequences, and then you come home and everyone wants to shake your hand and thank you for your service, and not one of them—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Not one of them has ever had to look a mother in the eye at Arlington and find something true to say. Kat stood still. "Danny Miller," Richard said. The name came out of him differently than anything else he'd said, quieter and with a weight that had clearly been carried a long time. Jason Wyatt. He finally turned his head toward the wall. 23 years old. Both of them. You know what 23 looks like when it's gone. You know what it looks like in a box at Arlington in October. The room held that for a moment. Kat's hand resting at her side closed into a loose fist. Just once. Then it opened again. "I gave the order," Richard continued. His voice was barely above a rough murmur now. "That's what nobody in this building understands. I gave the order that sent them into that alley. 10 seconds later, the ground came apart." He exhaled, slow and deliberate, the breath of a man who has told himself the same story so many times it has worn grooves into him. "And I have been living inside those 10 seconds for 12 years. Kat set the IV kit down on the tray table. Not quickly, not dramatically, just set it down with the care of someone who has decided to put their hands free. She walked to the door and turned the lock. Then she crossed to the window and drew the curtain. The room dimmed. Richard watched her without speaking, his expression shifting from hostility into something more uncertain, which in a man like him was its own kind of exposure. Kat reached up to the lanyard at her collar and lifted her badge over her head. She placed it on the table beside the IV kit, not in her pocket, not set aside, placed it there deliberately so he could see it. Then she reached down and pushed the left sleeve of her scrub top up to the elbow. The tattoo was there where it had always been, underneath the fabric she'd worn over it every shift for 6 years in this building. The ink was older now, the lines settled into her skin, the way things settle when they've been there long enough to belong. But the image was still clear. Fleet Marine Force. 3-5 Dark Horse. Richard Sterling went completely still. Kat pulled the chair from beside the door, not the chair nurses used when they charted positioned at a professional distance, but closer the way you'd move a chair to sit beside someone rather than across from them. She sat down, looked at him directly. "HM2. Catherine Bennett," she said. "I was a Navy hospital corpsman attached to 3-5. Sangan. April through September 2010. She kept her voice level, not flat, not clinical, but level in the way that means a person has decided to carry something without letting it carry them. "I remember Jason Wyatt. He used to call me Doc Benny because he couldn't be bothered with the second syllable." A breath. "I remember Danny Miller. He kept a photograph of his dog in the left breast pocket of his kit. He showed it to me the first week we were in country, because he said the dog was better looking than any of us and deserved recognition." Richard had not moved. "I was there when the IED detonated," Kat said. "I was the one who went to Danny afterward." She held his gaze. "I was the last face he saw." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it in that room. Richard's expression had changed into something that didn't have a clean name: shock and grief, and the very particular disorientation of a person whose fixed understanding of a situation has just been removed from under them. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost most of its authority. What remained was something older. "Why didn't you say this when you walked in?" Kat had known the question was coming. She'd thought about it for the full hour between visits in the consultation room at the nurses' station, during the 17 minutes before she picked up the IV kit. She had the answer ready, not because she'd rehearsed it, but because it was simply true. "Because I didn't want you to take the medication because of who I am," she said. "I didn't want you to lie down and cooperate because I'm someone from your unit, and that meant you owed me compliance." She leaned forward slightly, both forearms on her knees. "I wanted you to choose to live because you wanted to live. Not because I outranked your grief. Richard looked at her for a long time. The monitor tracked his heartbeat steady and elevated, doing its job whether or not anyone was paying attention. Then something went out of him, and not his strength exactly, but the particular rigidity of a man holding a perimeter he's no longer sure needs holding. His shoulders dropped a fraction. He looked down at his hands, which were resting on the blanket, and seemed almost surprised to find them there. "All right," he said. It wasn't much. 2 words, low and rough. But in the context of everything that had led to them, it was a great deal. Kat pulled the tray table back into position and returned to work. Her hands were steady, they were always steady, but the quality of the stillness in the room had changed. She prepped the site with the efficiency of someone who'd done this under considerably worse conditions than a climate-controlled hospital room, and Richard lay back and looked at the ceiling and let her. She placed the central line, cleanly secured it, and began the vancomycin infusion. The medication entered his bloodstream and began doing what it had been designed to do. She fired off a quick message to the nurse's station as she noted the infusion timeline in. Infusion running. Stand down on psych consult. 30 seconds later, Webb's reply came back a single word. Confirmed. The clock on the escalation had stopped. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The monitor settled slightly as his body acknowledged what was happening. The fever wouldn't break in an hour, it didn't work that way, but the escalation had been stopped. Richard was the one who broke the quiet. After I rotated back, he said, still looking at the ceiling, I didn't reach out to anyone from the unit. Not one person. His voice was quieter than it had been all morning. I told myself it was because I needed to move forward. That looking back would only make it worse. He exhaled slowly. The truth is, I couldn't look any of them in the face. Because they were there. They knew what I'd done. Kat was noting the infusion start time in the chart. She kept writing. I know, she said. I didn't reach out either. He turned his head toward her then. Not quickly, the motion of someone moving carefully through something unfamiliar. Same reason, he asked. Kat set the chart down. She looked at him, and for a moment, the professional distance she maintained with every patient in every room on every shift was simply not there. What was there instead was the face of someone who had carried the same weight he had in different pockets for just as long. Different reason, she said. Same result. He seemed to accept that. He looked back at the ceiling. The IV line ran its quiet course between the bag and the central line, and the room held them both in the particular intimacy of shared history that doesn't need explaining, because explaining it would only make it smaller. Then Richard began to talk. He didn't announce it. It came the way things come when they've been held too long, not with decision-ness, but with the inevitability of pressure finding release. He talked about the morning of the patrol, the intelligence report, the route decision, the order he gave. He talked about the 10 seconds before the detonation, which he had replayed so many times that he could account for every element of them, who was where, what the light looked like, the sound a dirt road makes before it doesn't exist anymore. He talked about the memorial at Arlington in October. The rows of white stones and the cold air, and the way Danny Miller's mother stood at the grave with her hands folded in front of her, not crying, which was somehow worse than crying. The way she looked at Richard when he came to stand beside her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the searching expression of a person who needed to know that her son's death had meant something, that it hadn't been random, that someone had been in charge and had known what they were doing. I shook her hand, Richard said. I told her Danny was one of the finest Marines I ever served with. I told her he died bravely. His voice was fraying now at the edges. And every word of that was true. and none of it was the truth I was carrying. His hand came up and covered his eyes, not to hide more the gesture of a man pressing against something from the outside because the pressure from the inside had gotten to be too much. I sent them into that alley, he said. That is the fact I have lived with. Every other fact arranges itself around that one. Kat sat with what he'd said. She didn't move to comfort him, didn't reach for the practiced reassurance that the situation seemed to call for. She sat with it the way you sit with something true, present, steady, not trying to make it smaller. Outside room 714, the hospital continued its work. Down the hall, Brenda was attending to other patients. At the nurses' station, charts were being updated and medications were being tracked, and the ordinary machinery of care was running the way it always ran. But inside the room, something was happening that had nothing to do with vancomycin or central lines or infection trajectories. A man who had been locked inside 12 years of a single verdict about himself had just said the verdict out loud to the one person on earth who had actually been there. And that was not the end of it. That was only the place where the truth could finally begin. Kat let him sit with what he'd said for a moment. The room was dim, the curtains still drawn, and the only sounds were the monitor and the slow drip of the IV line doing its quiet work. Then she stood, crossed to the chair where she'd set her canvas bag when she first came in, and removed a folded document. The paper had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases were soft, the corners slightly rounded. She set it on the edge of the bed within his reach, but not pressed into his hands. Richard looked at it without touching it. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 2019, Kat said. The post-action report from the Sangan Patrol. It took 4 years to come back. She looked at the document on the bed. I received it 6 months ago before you were admitted here. Richard's eyes moved from the document to her face. The report was classified immediately after the engagement, she continued. Standard procedure when the operational details involved assets and methods that weren't ready for disclosure. Which means you were never given the full account of what happened in that alley. What you've been carrying for 12 years, the version of events you've been living in, is incomplete. Incomplete, he repeated. The word came out flat, like he was testing whether it could hold any weight. Miller and Wyatt didn't die because you sent them into an ambush. Kat kept her voice steady, the way she kept her hands steady, not because she was feeling nothing, but because the feeling had to go somewhere. It wouldn't get in the way of what needed to be said. They went into that alley because they saw something. She nodded toward the document. He reached out and picked it up. There was a vehicle positioned inside the alley, she said, while he unfolded the paper with the careful movements of a man who has learned to be deliberate about things that matter. A Toyota Hilux, loaded. The report estimates the payload at enough to destroy multiple vehicles and anyone within a 40-meter radius. She let him read the line himself before she continued. It had been staged to pull out onto the main road and drive directly into the convoy, your convoy, the one carrying over 40 Marines. Richard's eyes moved across the page. His face had gone very still. Danny and Jason spotted the vehicle before anyone else, Kat said. The report reconstructs the timeline from the physical evidence and the accounts of the 2 Marines who were at the alley entrance and survived. Miller and Wyatt moved in because they understood exactly what would happen if that truck reached the road. She held his gaze when he looked up from the paper. They didn't have time to radio it up the chain. They made the call themselves. In the time they had with the information they had, they made the only decision that made sense to them. Richard looked back down at the document. His jaw was working, but no words were coming out. If that truck had reached the main road, Kat said, the casualty count would have been catastrophic. The report uses the word catastrophic. 40 men minimum, possibly more. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Including you. The paper in Richard's hands was trembling slightly. Not from weakness, from the effort of holding something still when everything inside was trying to move. They knew the risk, Kat said. The same way they always knew the risk every time they went outside the wire. They ran toward that vehicle because that's who they were. That's what you trained them to be. Her voice didn't break, but it dropped lower. Danny Miller died protecting the men in that convoy. That is the true account. That is what his mother deserved to know. That is what you deserved to know 12 years ago. Richard set the document down on the blanket. He placed both hands flat on either side of it, like he needed the contact with something solid. The sob when it came was the kind that has been held too long. It moved through him like something structural giving way, not collapse, but release the distinction between those two things being everything. 12 years of a verdict he'd rendered against himself, 12 years of Arlington in October, and a mother's searching eyes, and the specific torture of not being able to answer the question behind them. All of it broke open in the dim room with the curtain drawn and the IV line running, and the monitor recording his vital signs, which were for the first time since he'd been admitted, beginning to trend in the right direction. Kat moved from the chair to the edge of the bed. She put her hand on his shoulder, not the hand of a nurse checking a patient, but the hand of someone who had been in the same valley, breathed the same dust, listened to the same silences after the noise stopped. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the truth hadn't already said. He didn't try to stop the grief. That was the thing she noticed, and would remember later he let it come. After 12 years of building walls around it, he simply let it come through. Outside in the corridor, Brenda had been passing with a medication cart when she heard the change in the quality of sound from room 714. She stopped at the narrow window beside the door and looked through it. She couldn't hear the words. She could see Kat sitting on the edge of the bed, with her hand on Richard's shoulder, and Richard bent forward with his face in his hands, and the whole geometry of the room was different from anything she'd seen in that space before. Dr. Webb appeared beside her a moment later, drawn by the same instinct, and he looked through the window and took in the scene. His hand went to the door handle, a reflex. Brenda put her hand over his. "Leave them," she said quietly. Webb looked at her. "She's got him," Brenda said. "Leave them." Webb's hand came away from the door. He stood there for another moment, then nodded once and moved on. Brenda stayed a little longer watching through the narrow window, and what she understood in that moment, without knowing the specifics, without knowing about Sangin, or the FOIA document, or the Toyota Hilux, was that Kat hadn't simply reached a difficult patient. She had walked into a room where a person was dying of something medicine couldn't treat, and she had treated it. Inside the room, Richard eventually straightened. He looked at the ceiling for a long moment, breathing deliberately, getting his bearings in the way a person does when they've come through something and need to locate themselves on the other side of it. His face was wet, and he didn't try to hide it. He picked up the document from the blanket, folded it along its worn creases, and held it in both hands. 12 years, he said. His voice was raw and quiet. "I didn't know." "No," Kat said. "You didn't." She looked at me at Arlington. He meant Danny's mother, and Kat knew it without clarification. Every year I told myself I should reach out to her, tell her something. I never could find the words that weren't a lie. "You can find them now," Kat said. He looked at her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and what was in his expression was something that doesn't get exchanged between strangers or even between colleagues, but only between people who have stood in the same particular darkness and found each other there. "Yeah," he said, "I think I can." The vancomycin continued its work. His fever would break properly that evening, and by the following morning, his numbers would show the first real improvement since admission. The infection that had been advancing steadily for weeks had met its counterforce, and the counterforce was winning. His body, it turned out, still wanted to live. It had simply been waiting for permission. The 2 weeks that followed were unremarkable in the way that genuine recovery is unremarkable. It lacks the drama of crisis trading, emergency for the steady accumulation of better mornings. Richard Sterling was not suddenly transformed into an easy patient. He was still direct, still particular about how things were done, still the kind of man who would tell you exactly what he thought, without softening it for your comfort. But the hostility was gone. What replaced it was something quieter and more substantial, a man who had been carrying a false conviction for 12 years and had set it down and was now discovering what it felt like to move without that weight. He followed his treatment plan without argument. He addressed the staff by name. One morning he carried his own breakfast tray back to the cart in the hallway and nodded to Brenda as he passed, and that nod communicated more than a formal apology would have. With Kat, his manner was different from how it was with anyone else on the floor. Not deferential, Richard Sterling was constitutionally incapable of deferential, but something more honest than that. The way he spoke to her was the way people speak to those with whom they share a history that can't be summarized directly, without performance, with the specific ease of someone who knows they don't have to explain the references. On the day of his discharge, Kat received a message from the front desk at 7:40 in the morning. There were people in the main lobby asking for her. She came down 20 minutes later, still in her scrubs from the early part of her shift, and stopped at the lobby entrance. Richard was standing near the center of the lobby. He was standing without his cane against the recommendation of his physical therapist, which surprised no one who knew anything about him. Beside him were 6 men. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but they stood in a way that civilian clothes couldn't entirely cover. One had lost his left arm above the shoulder. Another had the particular gait of a prosthetic leg. All of them had faces that carried the specific quality of people who have looked at things that can't be unseen and made their peace with living afterward anyway. Kat recognized what she was looking at before anyone spoke. Richard stepped forward when he saw her. He was carrying a small wooden box, the kind made for things that deserve to be kept. He held it the way you hold something that belongs to someone else. "Danny's mother kept these," he said. "After Arlington, she told me she'd give them to me when she believed I'd found some peace. She said she'd know when it was time." He looked down at the box for a moment, then back at Kat. "I called her 3 days ago. She sent these overnight." He held the box out, and Kat took it. Inside, resting on a fold of dark cloth, were Danny Miller's dog tags. The metal was worn in the way that things are worn by years of being handled, not by time alone, but by the attention of someone who needed to hold on to something real. Kat looked at the tags for a long moment. She thought about the left breast pocket of a set of kit, and a photograph of a dog and a 23-year-old who had run toward a truck full of explosives, because the math of the situation was clear to him, and he'd acted on it without waiting to be told. "He'd want you to have them, Doc," Richard said. "You were the last person he saw. That matters." Kat closed the box. What happened next happened without a command being given, which made it mean more than if one had been. All 7 men, Richard and the 6 beside him, came to attention simultaneously. Their spines straightened. Their chins lifted, their right hands rose to the precise angle that the United States military had defined across generations as the gesture of formal recognition. They held it. Kat stood at the center of the lobby with the wooden box in her hands, and for a moment she was not a nurse in a VA hospital, and they were not veterans in civilian clothes, and the distance between then and now collapsed entirely. She came to attention. She returned the salute. She had not cried in this building in 6 years. The long sleeves had been part of that, a way of keeping the past in its place, of maintaining the boundary between who she had been and who she was here. But the box was in her hands, and the dog tags were inside it, and the 7 men in front of her were standing at attention in a hospital lobby on a Tuesday morning because they had decided this was worth doing, and the tears came without asking permission. She let them. The real heroes in this world don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they show up in scrubs in silence, carrying wounds no one can see, and they choose every single day to walk back into the room anyway. Richard Sterling spent 12 years punishing himself for a verdict that was never true. And it took one person, someone who had been there, who knew the weight of it firsthand, to finally hand him the truth he'd been denied. That's the thing about people. You never really know what someone is carrying until they decide to show you. The nurse you dismiss might be the corpsman who held your men. The quiet coworker with the long sleeves might have earned something no one in the room could imagine. Every person around you has a story you haven't heard yet. Don't be so quick to decide who someone is before you know who they've been. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. Every week we bring you stories like this one, real human and worth your time. We'll see you in the next one.